Hey there, it's Mike Langford. Welcome to another episode of the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast, brought to you by Truelytics, the one and only comprehensive advisor transition management platform. This week on the show, I have Tom Hine, the author of the Zen of Business Acquisitions, with me. Tom is also the CEO of Capital Wealth Management, based in Glastonbury, Connecticut. So he knows a thing or two about acquiring other businesses. He's acquired a few in building Capital Wealth Management, and he's talked to lots of experts in the book about the process. And one of those experts, by the way, is Terry Mullen, the CEO of Truelytics. And as you might imagine, being the comprehensive advisor transition management platform, business acquisitions are a big part of advisor transition management. Many advisors at some point in time will transition out of the business, and they will sell their business either via a planned succession or just outright sale to another advisor, right? And there are advisors out there that are looking to acquire other businesses as part of their growth strategy or their evolution strategy. So really, really important and timely stuff. Tom is fantastic. He's very engaging, as I like to say, good bedside manner, if you will. It just like makes you feel comfortable like immediately about the topic and kind of lowers the anxiety level, as you'll hear us talk about, because hey, if you're going through a business acquisition, whether it's your first time or third time or seventh time, there's always a bit of, I hope everything goes right. I hope I asked all the right questions or covered all the right things and covered my butt and I'm not getting taken advantage of, or all the clients transition over, right? All that type of stuff's running through your head, right? So Tom does a really good job of bringing the Zen to the process, okay? I think you're really going to enjoy this episode of the show. Before we get to the conversation with Tom, as always, please do make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube, wherever you like to get your podcast jam on. That YouTube channel is absolutely crushing it. Or if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, it's killing it. So make sure you click that subscribe button. Add some comments, by the way. Let us know what you like about the show. And while we're on that topic of letting us know, please do send in your questions and suggestions for guests or topics for this show. You can reach out to us at podcast@truelytics.com, or you can swing by truelytics.com and use the little contact form there. Anyway, gets it to us, or you can just hook us up on the socials, right? Truelytics is active on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, the YouTubes. You can also find me. I'm at Mike Langford, basically everywhere. We love to hear from you. That's actually how Tom got on the show. I mean, yes, he interviewed Terry Mullen for the book. However, he didn't go through Terry Mullen and go, hey, Terry, since I interviewed you, I'd like to be on your podcast. No, he actually just reached out and said, hey, listen, love the podcast. I think I would be a really good guest. I have some good stuff to share with your audience about business acquisitions. He didn't even mention Terry Mullen in that outreach. So he wasn't trying to play favorites, right? He's like, hey, listen, this is really interesting content. He could have just gone through Terry, by the way. Anyways, this is a really good show. I think you're going to love it. Okay, let's get to the conversation with Tom Hine about the Zen of Business Acquisitions. Let's do it. All right. Well, Tom Hine, thank you very much for getting up in the morning here with me and to spend some time on the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast. I have your book right here. I'm looking forward to getting my Zen on for the Zen of Business Acquisition. So welcome to the show, buddy.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Yeah, it's a great time of year. I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving. It's a great time of year to talk about what we do for a living, for acquisitions and the business space. And actually, in January, my audiobook of that same book is going to be released. So this is the first time where the book itself is on Amazon, but then we're going to the next step and fine-tuning the last couple chapters of the actual audiobook, which will make it even easier to listen to on your phone or wherever you want to listen to.
I love it. I'm going to listen to the audiobook. Now, I've read through the book. I love audiobooks. I'm particularly fond of the ones where the author actually reads the audiobook his or herself, right? Because
yep.
I don't know about you, but when you read, there's a voice happening in your head when you're reading the words, right? And so especially if you know the author, and now that you and I know each other, and for the listeners, by the way, or viewers over on YouTube, this is the second time we're recording this podcast due to some technical issues that happened in the first one. So now you and I are like buddies. Like I feel like we've spent a lot of time together. I feel like I know you. And as I mentioned in the intro video, kind of promoting this episode, you've got this great, kind of bedside manner. You've got this just a great approach about you. So I'm looking forward to hearing the audiobook in your voice.
Thank you. And I will share with your listeners, because it is the up and coming trend. If you do get a chance, the recording the audiobook, it's harder than it seems in the beginning because you're not used to having to read for an hour at a time
Mhm.
without coughing or sounds or all that. So what I would remind people is, in the end, when you're done with it, it's a far more fascinating look into the publication of the book. But it took me a while to get a routine down
Yeah.
where I could feel comfortable recording, knowing like 1 hour would turn into one good hour. But that I'll just pass on that it's harder, but when you get done, it's a very, very satisfying feeling.
You know, it's really, I'm glad you brought that up. And I think, by the way, this is a good part of this conversation because you're not the first advisor to write a book, and you certainly won't be the last to write a book. And I think a lot of people, writing a book is a great tool. It's a great process to go through. It helps you shape your thinking and so forth. One of the things you just mentioned there about reading a book, even your own writing is harder than it looks. I can speak, validate that from my experience in that, I do a lot of podcasting, obviously, and I do a lot of video, and frequently I will read a little bit of a script. Like, I'll write something to read, or I'll do voiceover work. And it's interesting. You wrote the words, you see it on the page, like, that sounds great. I love the way this presents. And then you read it out loud. You're like, that is terrible to read. That is really difficult to read that string of sentences because they weren't in your brain. You weren't thinking about saying them out loud. You were thinking about typing something that, presents itself well. So how did you handle that? Because, again, you wrote the book, but maybe when you're writing it, you were thinking about this is going to be out loud someday.
Correct. And by the way, yeah, when you're writing it, of course, you have many, many goes, right? You can
Yeah.
edit, you send it back to either your marketing editor or your what they call your DE or developmental editor, and they can come back and say, I like this story, this needs more color, this needs more background. So you have many bites of the apple. But ideally, when you're recording it, reading it, you don't want to have too many retakes because number one, you do get bored of if you read the same paragraph over and over. But more importantly, you'll never finish the book if you keep doing redos on chapter one. So what I would say is you learn to block off almost like meditation time. You block off that hour or two, typically in the morning when things will be quieter. And the second thing that's fascinating is I would often browse the chapter ahead on I got two Microsoft Surface Pros. So I had two of them, so that one of them would be the recording one where I used Audacity, the software. The other one, I could scroll and read because you don't want to have a physical book because you'll hear the pages while you're turning them. So you have to remember, you have to read it with no sound in the background. So you end up, for me, I use two monitors, and that seemed to work really well.
That's really, really interesting. Malcolm Gladwell, famous author and podcaster and so forth, he recently released a book, something with strangers. I want to say, anyway,
Talking with Strangers.
Talking with Strangers. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I haven't actually got it yet, but he said they decided to do the book like an audio, but like a podcast, basically, right? Yep. So kind of audio first. So the interviews, like a lot of times you read an interview and it's like, oh, I'm interviewing and talking to this person. He's like, I'm going to go actually talk to that person, and that's going to go into the audiobook. And he kind of thought of it as an audiobook first. And he made a prediction. I've heard him interviewed about Talking with Strangers. He says he thinks this is the way it's going to go. People are going to kind of think audiobook first, and then have it. And actually, I think if I was going to do a book, I'd probably do it that way because I don't know how if I would have the patience and the tenacity that you had to crank through the book, because it's not like it's one of those little quick books that it's basically a pamphlet. This is a legit book. This is like actual work went into this thing. So why don't we dive into that a little bit more? What was your motivation for writing the book? I mean, like I said earlier, many advisors, many business leaders will eventually write a book for a variety of reasons. But what was your motivation for deciding to write this book, The Zen of Business Acquisitions?
Yeah, there were a couple of key ones, Mike. One of them was the most obvious. Even though I had done many acquisitions, I wanted to put down a template, if you will, for how I learned how to do them and share that knowledge with other advisors, because the space, as you know, is so big that even for as many acquisitions as I've looked at, I'll never cover the universe. So I thought one thing would be great would be to get that wisdom of what I had learned. And then soon after beginning the project, I realized, wait a minute, I have a chance to interview some of the big titans of our industry. And so these are some of the big players like Ron Carson, at Carson Wealth, or Terry Mullen at Trulytics, as you know. So I got a chance to go, wow, I can learn if you will, standing on the shoulders of giants and learn a lot more. So when I got into the weeds of it, I realized it wouldn't just be a how-to. It would be like, how did the very best of the business do what they did? And how can that ripple down to the average advisor who might be putting off a continuity or a succession plan? And if this simple, really, it's very simply written, can get them motivated to complete something, then it will have met its target of getting people to finalize that plan. So in the beginning, I wanted to learn more about it for myself. And then I realized what a great chance to learn from others who have climbed further up the mountain than I have.
I really love that. It's, obviously, there's some things you're hoping to get out of it yourself, but there is an altruism. There is a bit of service that comes through in that approach. Hey, listen, I'm going to go talk to the experts and kind of distill this stuff and put it out into the world. And that's one of the things we always talk about with books, right? Like, you're not just spending the $12.95 or $20 or whatever it is that you spend on the book, right? You're buying all the work, the accumulation of that wisdom. And when you were talking about, why don't I go talk to these people who are the best in the field, world-class leaders in this space, I'm reminded of a gentleman by the name of Samir Vazvada, that we had on the show. He's one of the founders of Vise. Mm-hmm. And him and his co-founder, Runic, there are really young dudes. They're in their early 20s, and yet they've raised tens of millions of dollars, and they're doing a fantastic job here and kind of taking the industry by storm in the asset management space. And I asked them, like, you guys are doing really good here. How is it that you're so young and you're doing such a good job? And he's like, you know what? We learned just to ask experts. Like, somewhere this problem has already been solved, right?
Yes.
Like, we don't have to figure it out ourselves. Just go find the people who have done it before, or ask somebody. Like, if you had to say who's the best person in the world about this thing, go ask them. Go talk to that person and ask if somebody can connect you with them. And you've really done that here in this book. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's been a great journey. And I can tell you along the way, too, what was interesting, Mike, each person, had their own flavor of how they got to their level of success. And so each story, while in the end, they all related somehow, to acquisitions or continuity plan or succession plan, everybody had their own journey. And that's the fun thing, is listening to all the different stories. And what very, very clearly came out in every single one, which would be no surprise, to our audience, but it would be a good motivator, is everybody had tons of challenges along the way. Nobody struck it rich on their first try. Nobody hit that grand slam. And so quite often in business, we see these great people who've achieved a lot, and we forget that they were, as my analogy, they were once white belts.
Yeah.
If you look at the martial arts analogy, even the best masters of the world were once a white belt, but we only see them as a master. And so we forget that their lessons along the way was what helped shape their journey and their life. And that's why I like to mix in the martial arts philosophy with the business one, because in the end, they are very analogous to journeys where you overcome obstacles, you learn perseverance, and in the end, you come out hopefully with not just the goal, but the wisdom. And that's what I wanted to pass on to everyone, was the wisdom of how to make things easier. I even have a chapter called How to Hack This Book, at the end, which is, as you know, it's a favorite one. People go right to that one going, here are all the lessons in one chapter.
Yeah, it's a crib notes, if you will, right? For guys of our age, we used to have crib notes. We had to read along like Shakespeare thing. Like, I'm not getting through Shakespeare. I'm going to get the crib notes on that bad boy. And the teachers knew, by the way, they knew that. Anyway, but in real life, that's one of the funny things. I'm glad you put that in there, by the way, because, and I'm trying to teach my kids that. I've got, a high schooler and a middle schooler. And, I always, look, right now you got to go through the process, but the reality is, in the real world, you're going to be able to use your calculator or a spreadsheet or go to Google to get that answer, right? But like, you do need to know how to do this type of stuff. But that's really fascinating. You actually mentioned Terry. So it's one of those full disclosure things. You're on the Modern Financial Advisor podcast by Truelytics, and you happen to interview Terry Mullen, the CEO of Truelytics, for the book in the first chapter. How did you guys meet, by the way? I'm glad you reached out to get on the show. You followed the thing that we always say, like, hey, listen, if you think you'd be good for the show, reach on out. We'd like to talk to you. And you did, and here you are. But I didn't know it when you first reached out that Terry was actually in the book. So how did the two of you guys get together, and how did that chapter come about?
Yeah, it's a great story. So one of my contacts, having been at different broker dealers, in my lifetime, one of my prior contacts that was at a different broker dealer, I had reached out to him and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about writing this book on acquisitions." And between him and one of my other coaches, they said, that kind of book has already been done, in terms of the industry standard. So we talked about some ideas. I said, well, actually, it's not about how I've done them. I'm going to add some wisdom. It's about other people. And that's when we hit the nail on the head. He goes, you know what? Because I know a bunch of people in the industry because he runs a smaller broker dealer in the Southeast. And he said, I got a handful of people, including Terry Mullen. And within a few days, my friend Chris Flint reached out and set up interviews so that I could talk to Terry live. And of course, Chris vouched for me because I had known him in the past, which was great. And on top of that, I learned so much, from the early interviews that I said, I've got a lot of material here. So Chris, I give him a lot of credit, was the one that reached out, got the ball rolling. And soon enough, Terry's story became among the most fascinating ones in the book. That's why I put it first.
I love it. I love it. And, as people who are listening to this podcast regularly know, and if you're a first timer, Truelytics is a business intelligence solution. We call it a comprehensive advisor transition management platform. So, if you're thinking of a business acquisition, some of the things you're going to want to know is what's the quality of the business, right? So Truelytics, if you use a True Performance Scorecard, it's going to tell you a lot about how good your business is and how good the other business is and how ready it is for acquisition or to go through the acquiring process. But also there's a valuation calculator built in there too. So you'll find out what the business is valued at based on a variety of metrics, and whether that's discounted cash flows or some others. So just for those who are not necessarily in the know. Let's dive into the Zen part. This is my most fascinating part because you've taught me a lot about this in a framework that I didn't know about, frankly, because when I always thought about Zen, and I'm not a martial arts expert, and I'm not somebody who follows Asian wisdom or study or philosophies super deeply. But when I always thought about Zen, I always thought of kind of like the almost like yoga-ish, right? Like I'm gonna sit there and get into a Zen and meditate maybe and just chill. I'm feeling Zen, right? That would be a phrase that I would use. I'm feeling pretty Zen right now. What do when you think about it differently though? You approach the Zen process a little differently. So what do you consider Zen concepts?
Yeah, so I brought up two, and thanks for asking. So I've been in martial arts for over 35 years. And I have trained under some of the best masters in the world. I mean, they're really true traditional, Japanese masters. And what occurred to me when I was, hitting on this early nugget of the book was not just to write about the acquisitions, but to add each chapter has a philosophical quote at the beginning of the chapter, as you know. So think of this. Two of the key aspects of Zen, one is called the beginner's mind. And I can't emphasize that enough. And I thought, what a great way to teach the audience. If this is your first time either looking at, and I'll define in a moment, by the way, continuity and succession planning. Don't let me forget that point. That's going to be key. But I wanted to define for the beginner, right? When you're a white belt in martial arts, you come into the dojo, you don't know anything. You don't even know how to bow. And they teach you, how to bow, how to make a fist, etc. Well, I thought, let's do the same thing. So the beginner's mind attitude means that when you're approaching acquisitions or continuity plans, since you're a beginner, all the options are open to you. You ask a lot of questions. And as we talked about just now, like these gentlemen that formed that great startup, when you ask a lot of the right questions to the right people, you get a lot of wisdom. So that was the first thing I wanted people to understand is nobody gets dropped into the acquisition space and gets it right. In fact, Ron Carson said his first acquisition was a disaster. It was a complete clash of cultures. He didn't know any better, but he started off as a white belt, and now I would say he's at the advanced level of black belt. So number one, that's the the beginner's mind. Okay. And then the true purpose of Zen, I have a quote in there, is to see things as they are. And the reason why I thought that was important is we often, and I'm one of them, get so hyped up. I mean, I've probably looked at over 100 firms. I'm working on acquisitions 8 and 9 as we speak, but we get so hyped up that we want to do, number 10, number 11, that we forget to sit back and let's say, okay, what's the purpose of this particular acquisition? What am I doing it for? Who does it help? Is this good for my team? Is it good for my clients? So in that sense, I wanted to slow things down with the Zen aspect and say, just like somebody would meditate and they tell you, take some deep breaths, is to really spend the time to think about, why am I doing this? And that's one of my best um, pieces of wisdom for the audience. And this was a quote from one of my interviews, was the best deals are the bad ones that you never do. You might think, well, that's counterintuitive, right? But what we're saying is, if you buy a bunch of bad firms, you'll create a nightmare for yourself and your team, and you'll go down the wrong path for years. So if you avoid the negative ones and focus on the very few positive ones in the beginning, you're going to have a much more peaceful, hence Zen existence. But if you go after shooting basically a shotgun on the wall approach, you may get a lot of firms, but you'll create a lot of chaos. And that's not what I wanted to promote in this book. I want to promote simplicity, step by step, ease of use, ease of management, not much breakage, as they say, in the onboarding. That was the goal. So it's the true purpose of Zen and the beginner's mind, or that white belt feeling. Those were two of the themes I wanted to make sure I got out there.
I really like that. You mentioned simplicity there, and you also mentioned kind of saying no. The deals you don't do are often the most important deals. Kind of the paraphrase what you were saying there. Steve Jobs was famously made the whole Apple business empire with that concept of like saying no is more important than saying yes, right? Like when you think about how simple the iPhone, when it first came out, how revolutionary, that was, right? Phones had lots of buttons on them. Everybody was using Blackberries or other, Windows mobile type of thing where there were had full keyboard on it, buttons to call if you didn't have a smartphone, and suddenly you get this plain piece of glass, right, with one button, a home button type deal on it, and people are just blown away with this thing, the simplicity of it, how easy it was to use. Well, that took a lot of saying no to, like, what if we add this? What if we add this? And there were some frustrating limitations to that early iPhone, right? Because of all the no's, and they had to find like what do we actually say yes to? I really like that. I like that kind of framework on making it simpler for yourself, and focusing with that beginner's mind, asking the questions and realizing that you are going to screw up at the beginning. It's not going to go 100% smoothly.
Right. But if you recall too, one of the first, I remember first marketing pieces about Google.
Yeah.
Right. And their search engine was, when the screen scrolled down and there was that one bar to enter information, the people in the demo, as I heard, I obviously wasn't there, the story was told, they're saying, well, what else? What else is going to be downloaded?
Yeah.
Saying nothing, that's it. And it was almost like the Seinfeld joke about, wait, it's a joke about nothing. Yeah. This is a comedy about nothing.
Yeah.
But in simplicity, right, just like Google, it was so straightforward. They didn't have a lot on that homepage. They still don't, right, to this day.
Yeah.
So less is more. Less is more.
I agree. 100%. It's just there's a startup book, design book called "Don't Make Me Think." It's old. It's probably 20 years old now, but it's around that concept. Like, don't make me have to think too hard about what to do here. One of the things I build this episode as, kind of transitioning a little bit. One of the things that I build this episode as is an anxiety alleviating conversation.
Yes.
Because most folks have never been through a business acquisition, either as a acquirer or a seller. Most folks have never been through succession planning, just like straight up succession planning. You talk about continuity as well. Most of the people in the industry have not gone through that process yet, right? We've got hundreds of thousands of advisors out there. We are kind of coming to the tail end of the first generation of financial advisors as you know them, right? Coming out of stockbroker world into financial advisors, and estimates are that 40% are 60 and older, so we're probably reaching close to the end of that first generation, and the new generations are coming up. But there's a lot of anxiety anytime you're doing something for the first time, and even if you're doing it for the second or third time, there might also be some anxiety. I mean, hey, listen, we've all moved houses. Well, many of us have moved houses multiple times. It never gets less anxiety-inducing to move a house, right? Like, do I pack everything? How am I going to handle all this type of stuff? I got to still work. I got to manage all this stuff. And geez, can't wait to be able to chill in my new house. Was that part of your mindset when you were writing the book, that, hey, listen, I need to help people alleviate some of their nerves?
Absolutely. And I try to make it simple. So getting back to the definitions, which are important. So think of this too, a continuity plan, which by the way, by many estimates in all the people I interviewed in the book, including Dan Croder of Gladstone and Ron Carson and Terry Mellon, at least 80% of advisors don't have a well thought out written, we say continuity or succession plan. Continuity plan is, God forbid I get hit by the bus tomorrow morning, I didn't have time to plan. What happens to my practice? So
Right.
continuity plan, I'll be working on I'm going to try to have a 20-minute video, called the 20-minute continuity plan. That would be the most important because that just says, I call it the fire alarm, break glass in case of emergency.
Yeah.
But the better one, Mike, we talk about is the well thought out succession plan. That's the 5 or 10-year plan where you groom your successors, you hire them and you train them in your way. And that's the ultimate goal of the book. But as you mentioned, reducing anxiety, continuity plan doesn't have to be that involved to have something on paper. And believe it or not, the clients and your employees will thank you because in the end, they're going to be worried about their future. And oftentimes, as all these practices that I've acquired, we end up taking on more outside money, we call it, money that wasn't with the original firm. Because what do the clients say? Oh, now that, now that you have an advisor or a team behind you, your succession plan, we'll turn over the rest of our money. And a lot of advisors are surprised. And the joke in our industry, as you know, is, oh, I have all my clients' money. And the answer is no, you never do. The clients will divvy it up, between different advisors or platforms, whatever they feel comfortable, until they believe they can find a solution, that meets all of their needs. So absolutely, it helps advisors communicate that the continuity plan, which can be a 1 or 2 pager, believe it or not, is done. And then that can lead you into thinking of, all right, what's my long-term succession plan? And that one, you have more time because you've already got what I call the break glass in case of emergency button already done, with the continuity plan.
I like that you bring that up, and it's interesting. There's an advisor here in Austin, Texas, who's client, and he talked about, my continuity plan is actually a piece of marketing material for me, because when I sit down with a prospective client or couple, whatever it is, it's what I lead with. Hey, listen, if you come to work with us, this is a real business here. Like,
yes.
If something happens to me, if I have a heart attack or get hit by a bus tomorrow, whatever, hunting accident, whatever the deal is, here's what would happen to your account, right? Like, yep. This advisor would step in, and that, here's the process. Here's what it looks like. And to your point, 2 pages. It does not, like, first of all, nobody wants to read through this long document, from a continuity. It can be relatively simple. Like, okay, who takes over in the event of death or disability? What's the process for moving the accounts over there? Who gets called first, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Truelytics has their true continuity solution, and it's like a locker for holding all that information, and it makes it really simple. Walk it through. Okay, who's your continuity partner? Who should they call first, right? They got called these clients. What are the who's the broker dealer contact? Who's the landlord for the office space? What, all that type of stuff. Really, really simple stuff. Probably take you an afternoon to get it done.
Right. And the big fear we talked about earlier, Mike, the reason why, after interviewing myself, hundreds of advisors, there's a few categories that are common to why people put it off, right? The same thing, by the way, I ask advisors, if your top clients didn't have a will, would you let that go on for years and years? And every advisor says, no, I would make sure they get to an attorney, right, and get a will for their own estate plan. So some of the reasons are advisors either don't know, the right person, obviously, in their continuity plan. So when they don't know, they default to doing nothing. Sometimes they're not comfortable if they're in a large networked office, with a firm. Maybe they want to look outside that. So it's very tough for them, to develop contacts outside that office space. Sometimes they're not comfortable with the business model that they're in. Maybe they want to go over to fee-based, asset management, or maybe they want to go hourly, retainer, whatever, and the model they're in doesn't have that. Sometimes it's fear of their own future. Like, what will I do, after I leave my practice? That's a biggie. So I try to make sure that advisors realize all those excuses are valid, but they're not an excuse to stop you from doing something. They're all reasons, why you can't have the perfect plan. But oftentimes, many coaching programs tell you if you get 80% of the way there, that's very good. You don't have to get 100% on day one. And
Yeah.
that's part of it. You don't have to have a perfect plan. And I just echo in one of the interviews, the advisor said he asked his top clients what they thought of his first succession plan years ago. And they hated it. They said, absolutely not. If you died, we'd leave. So he sort of metaphorically, right, ripped up that plan and did a new one. And that's what I share with my clients now that they've known I've had my own plan for many years. So, as you said, it's actually a very, if an advisor gets to be in their 50s or 60s, it's a very important point. I mean, one statistic I gathered in writing the book, there are more CFPs older than age 70 than there are under age 30 in this industry. So you can imagine what that means for people not planning for their continuity. So yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect, but get it on paper, get it started. And like anything else, you can revise it over time and then you'll feel great. And so will your family, your employees, and obviously your clients will feel great about it too.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and it's probably similar to the advice that advisors give their clients, right? Like, especially if you get a client who comes in and really doesn't feel like they're where they want to be financially, right? That they're not necessarily close to achieving their goals. It's like, okay, let's just get started, right? Everybody, the famous, the journey of a 1,000 miles starts with a single step type of deal. You just like get the ball rolling, okay? You don't have to be perfect out of the gates. Your chances are you're probably going to make some mistakes, but that's okay. It's like, this is not something that's permanent immediately, right? It's like, okay, this is step one. This is phase one. If something happened today, this is what we do. And then you'll learn some more over time. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the other Zen concepts that you teach in the book. And maybe along that kind of like the practiced repetition concept, right? You talk a lot about that in the book. Why is that so important?
Sure. One of them is Kaizen,
Yeah.
which many people know. It's not a new term that was used in the business world, but this idea of continuous improvement.
Yeah.
And the reason why I mentioned Kaizen is, like Malcolm Gladwell, by the way, who I've seen in person twice over the past couple of years for different reasons, of his lecture series. But what's great is he mentioned the 10,000 hours. You may recall how the Beatles played in Germany well before they came back, to the UK. So the reason why the Kaizen is important, whether it's, tennis or skiing or yoga or martial arts, this muscle memory, this repetition of something gets you better and better at it. So for example, I can tell you many advisors are probably so used to doing fact finds that they could do them with their eyes closed, but yet in today's Zoom altered world or the altered world of COVID-19, it's now a different way to do a fact find over Zoom. So in a way, you're still practicing doing your client intake or your discovery meeting, but you're now having to do it with Zoom. And all of us admit that we love this as a people business, right? But in this era of COVID, we haven't been able to meet in person. So this idea of Kaizen, continuous improvement, that's a huge part about it, because whether you take how you manage money for a living, how you do your reviews, how you onboard clients, how you do your client events, whatever it is, take every little piece of the puzzle and try to tweak it and make it a little bit better. Oftentimes they'll tell you that the best and worst golfers, in the top 10 in the world, their putting strokes, if you do the mathematics, there's a slight difference, right, between the number one and number two and number three golfer. But a lot of it comes down to the slight difference of how they are in the greens, to finish out the hole. So that's number one, was Kaizen. And two is, again, perseverance, this idea that you're going to have to keep trying. I mean, I've talked to people who said, oh, I've talked to 2 or 3 people about someday selling my business and I gave up. I said, 2 or 3, try 200 or 300.
Yeah.
Right. If you talk to, and I'm not kidding now, of course, with Zoom and podcast, if you talk to 300 people, I guarantee you'll find at least one of that group that you'll say, wow, he or she is a great match for my philosophy. But if you talk to 3 or 4 people, the odds are pretty good you won't find anyone. So that's why I want to emphasize that, because especially today, more than ever, it used to be you had to sell to someone in your own town, right? Well, now with Zoom, it could be anybody in your state. And I could argue, I've done acquisitions as far south, I'm in Connecticut, as Boca Raton, Florida, and it worked well. And I've looked at ones as far north as Maine. So to me, it's not like it has to be in your own. Of course, it's easier when it's 30 miles from your home base. But I argue with the right processes and procedures, you could do it anywhere now, especially with what we've learned from COVID.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, by the way, that, we're in this space where a lot of us felt like our world became limited, right? More constrained because of COVID, right?
Yep.
But you just brought something up. Actually, opportunity has opened up, right? It mentally, you're thinking a little differently, and the receptivity to the concept of merger and acquisition at a distance, because you're suddenly talking to your clients like this, whereas before you might have felt like you had to be in person across the desk in your office. By the way, your clients never really like that anyway. Especially the younger clients. They didn't want to come to your office anyways. Total inconvenience for them to budget time to drive across town to whatever it is, or to have you come to their house so they feel like they need to vacuum and get all cleaned up before you come over to their house to sit at their kitchen table to talk about financial plans. So the notion that they can just like, yeah, let's fire up the Zoom and do this is probably welcomed by most of your clients, just so you know. But I was talking to Tammy Robinson. She was head of business development at a smaller broker dealer, and now she's moved to a larger one. And she was talking about a lot of advisors are starting to rethink their office expenditure, and they are starting to look at exactly what you talked about, acquisitions at a distance. They're like, this is wonderful, right? Like, why would I be limited to Connecticut? Why would I be limited to Austin, Texas? I can now look at other parts of the country and acquire a business there, or find succession partners for my business at other places, because why should it be limited to the people that I see all the time at the local financial planning association meeting?
Right. It's such a different world, Mike. And this was shared with me by Dan Sullivan of Strategic Coach on one of the recent Zoom meetings he had, because think about this. COVID, for all the challenges it has presented, and there are many tragedies and all, but he goes, think about this. In your lifetime, my lifetime, we now have one common thing with everyone in the world, right? COVID. Have you ever had that in your life where you could go anywhere in the world now or talk anywhere in the world and you'll have one thing in common that everyone understands? That's never happened in our lifetime.
Good point.
So all of a sudden it brings us closer together, because then it's, how are you dealing with COVID? And what are you doing? And how am I dealing? And what's the different metrics for, is it a 5% positivity rate? And then you close down. All these things are new, but in the end, it is still back to basics. I want to mention a few things, if I can.
Sure.
On that summary chapter, there were some key aspects that I learned about, client service, valuation, culture, perseverance. All those things come into play. And the biggest one is culture. In other words, if you don't have the right culture with the firm that you want to sell to or acquire, no amount of hard work and brilliance and hours put in by your team will overcome a clash of cultures. And if there's anything that your listeners can take away from this, it's don't, the expression in our business, don't fight the Fed, right? Well, don't fight bad culture, because you will absolutely, and I'm proud to say, because I worked for Accenture, Arthur Andersen years ago at different projects. And I was actually on a project where Bill Gates' sister was in the next room over. And I often joke and say, boy, I wish I'd bought Microsoft back then.
Yeah.
But what we learned with Accenture, which I carried into my practice, was this idea of systemization, right? Organization and structure, but don't fight the culture. And let me give a couple of examples, if I may, so that your listeners can know. So let's say, and these are extreme ones, but they'll give the example, will be easier to remember. Let's say I run a very high end, which I kind of do, wealth management, fee business.
Yeah.
It could be fee only, or in my case, asset management business. And I love it. And that's what I do. And I provide the white glove service. And I'm looking to acquire someone who's less than 40 miles away, and they have a bunch of A shares commission business, which on itself, you say, well, that's not bad. I could transfer that over into fee-based. But let's say the advisor purposely has a low touch environment. They're not mean. They love their clients, but they just call them once a year. They might have one service person. They might have 75 million in assets they've acquired. They have no client events. They don't do any reach outs, but their clients love them. They put them in the right fund family. Let's say it's, American funds. That, on the face of it, you might think, oh, this is an ideal acquisition. I would argue not that it couldn't work out, but without a meeting of the minds, I would argue that could be a clash of cultures where those clients don't want to pay a fee, aren't used to the hand holding, maybe don't miss it. And ultimately, in the end, you might be really sort of be like the salmon swimming upstream.
Yeah.
Another one could easily be an example. You're on the East Coast and you have a certain type of executive clientele, that's sort of hardworking entrepreneurs, pedal to the metal, and that's what they do. And then you look at a West Coast firm, which is more relaxed and laid back. And for whatever reason, they want success, but they want their personal time off and they believe in balance and all that. Again, it might be look like a good asset base, but if the cultures don't match or mesh, um, then in the end, I believe you'll be fighting uphill. And that's why people say, oh, I tried one, it didn't work out, or I talked to three people. So those are a couple of clear examples. But early on, most advisors know when their instincts tell them, oh boy, this doesn't feel like it'd be a good fit based on what I offer and what my team offers versus what they do.
Yeah, echoing the cultural fit importance, as I interviewed Nick Arellano over at Skyview Partners not too long ago, and that was one of his number one things when you were thinking about business acquisitions and that process is get the cultural fit right, and as you mentioned, there's a variety of levels of it. Right? Is it laid back culture, like you said, California versus Northeast? Is it? I mean, I would even say, and I, we hate bringing up politics, but like, look, we got quite a bit of political divide right now, and a lot of people in our country. And so, if you've got a very conservative clientele and an employee base, right? Some of these are not just solo practitioners here. If your employee base is, in a very conservative part of the country, the clients are conservative, the advisors and the team is, and you've got somebody who's a little more liberal. That might not work.
Exactly.
There's definitely going to be some resistance,
No, it's a great point.
Yeah.
You have to be careful because you're not going to convince people to change their ways.
Right.
They'll spend too much time doing that, not enough time watching over their asset base or talking about Roth conversions or second generation wealth transfer techniques. And that's where you want to spend your time.
Well, I was looking at removing friction, right? So I'm a huge fan of in your business life and in your real life, personal life as well, just try to remove as much friction as possible. Friction does help us grow, right? Of course, you do want to have some resistance and grow through it. But if we're doing a business acquisition or succession plan, let's not make it something that I have to work extra hard at some of the small stuff at, right? Like there's already going to be enough work, right? Converting accounts and repapering potentially if you're changing broker dealers. And so there's already going to be some heavy lifting involved. So don't add extra friction to it, like having to completely think about how do I mix these two disparate cultures. What are some of the trends you're seeing? So we're getting kind of, nearish to the end here. I want to make sure we cover a couple of concepts. One is trends, right? So obviously the industry's moving. It doesn't stay still. You must see a lot of movement. A lot of people are probably reaching out to you because you wrote the book on the Zen of Business Acquisition. What are some trends you're seeing in terms of things that they're thinking about?
Yeah, so this is a great question in terms of what I can share. So some of the people I interviewed in the book, for example, James Hughes, Live Oak Bank, right? Some of the trends in banking and financing are that if the buyers have the wherewithal, they're working on these sort of all 100% finance deals up front where the money's available. And that the seller doesn't have to worry about saying, well, when am I going to get my money, right? The seller's biggest concern is who's taking care of my clients? When do I get my money? So the Live Oak banks that stepped in maybe 2015, circa 2016, they've changed that from the way that I did my first deals, which were like 10% down, 40% note, and let's say 50% earnout. And those aren't being done. So some of the trends are the financing is available for the qualified buyer, let's say. That's a big one. And I talked to Carolyn Armitage of Echelon Partners, who did a great job sharing with me that some of the other trends are that the broker-dealer world has a certain amount of limitation versus the RIA world, right? So some of the trends are, even though I have acquired a couple of RIAs, in general, the RIA world is more plain vanilla. One IRA to acquire another RIA is easier to understand. There's less what they call breakage. In the broker-dealer world, not that it's a bad trend, but there's more moving parts. There's commission business, there's insurance, there's annuities, there's all sorts of things. There's FINRA regulation as opposed to SEC regulation. So that trend is be careful on what side of the pond you want to fish. Do you want to focus on the RIA world, which is great if you do. In our case, we can focus on both because we've been able to do that. So that's another trend. Dave Grau of FP Transitions, Dave Grau Sr. talked about, he thinks not enough is being done for the owners of G1, that would be my generation, baby boomers, to really get things in place for G2 and G3. So he'll say, we as an industry are not creating sustainable businesses, meaning to last beyond the first generation, because we're not putting the people in place, hiring bright young CFPs, giving them responsibility, watch how they do, and then groom them for the next phase up. That was his concern about that trend. In addition to, Dan Kreuter talks about some of the trends, some of the acquisitions that might be rushed, meaning people, it's cheap money. There's a lot of private equity money out there. He's saying there are 5 things you should get from every acquisition, which I find fascinating, from buying power, solutions and service power, brand power, staying power, and people power. So he's saying if you, in his world, that metric, if you don't have those 5 things, then that's not a good acquisition for you. So his concern is people might be rushing in because it's frothy and money has been cheap right now. So those are some of the counter trends that you hear. In one case, it's a great time to be a buyer, but on the other case, since financing is available, prices are going to be pushed up a bit, not only because of the good markets and because of COVID, but because their easy access to credit is out there.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid if you find a good match to pay up a little bit, not a lot, a little bit, because if you find a very good deal, it may take you a year or 2 to digest it while you're working on finding the next deal. So hopefully those are some of the themes that that resonate with your audience that really I got from some of the top producers and top thinkers, in our industry.
I really like the 5 powers that you were talking about, because those to me, I wrote a blog post maybe 2 years ago over in the Truelytics blog about considering the strategic value of the acquisition, right? A lot of us, we think about the money, right? With the assets I'm acquiring and how will that change the business and the revenue and profitability that'll come with it. But there are some strategic value that you're acquiring too, right? You're bringing on talent.
Absolutely.
So maybe you're bringing on young talent and that's setting you up to grow. Like it's not just the book of business you're buying. It's like, I'm bringing on some high quality talent. Maybe it's location, right? Maybe you're like, hey, listen, I'm in Austin, Texas. We want to also have an office in Houston. So then now I have a strategic value of like, I've got 2 anchor points between, east and west here, type of part of the state. And I'm able to kind of expand our book of business a little more greatly or footprint a little great. So there's a lot of those types of things. I like that way of thinking. One of the other things we were talking about not too long ago, as you're thinking about acquisition here, is being mindful of the client mix, right? That you're bringing on, right? Especially during a COVID, right? Some of these businesses, the client mix has been revealed to be particularly susceptible to negative economic downturns. Like if you have a client mix of restaurateurs,
yes,
that can be problematic right now, right? If like, hey, listen, I built up this great book of business. It's all the people who are the movers and shakers in the restaurant industry in Austin, Texas, they're my clients. Well, right now your client book looks really crappy. It's just scary.
That's a very good point, by the way, because whether it's clients or maybe people that did, real estate leasing, maybe in a bunch of top, commercial real estate people. And that's why we don't get in too much detail in the book, but that's why I talk about one of the other strategies or talents is the legal aspect, having a good corporate attorney, and I've had one for over a decade, that can really craft the right language, because you will have what they call, hooks or escape clauses, that if the revenue doesn't add up to what you thought through no fault of your own, that you don't want to be paying for revenue that you never got. So even though we don't cover it in detail, I do mention you want to have a great tax attorney or tax accountant and a great legal mind, because believe it or not, there's an art more than a science of how you craft, these agreements, that the buyer gets what he or she wants and the seller gets what he or she wants, and you can do it, but you got to have someone really a good craftsman in terms of the legal language. So thanks for bringing that point up, because it does matter what constitute your book, or if you have what we call concentration risk.
Yeah.
I went through a deal where the top 3 clients were 75% of the asset base, and it worked well, but we had to have many clauses and things in there. So the seller knew, look, we know it's not fair if you think if we're going to blow the deal, then you're going to say, well, if you blow the deal and I lose those clients, that's not my fault. But I would argue those clients are so precious to your practice that we have to handle them with kid gloves. Therefore, we have to have some extra language in there if they left, if one of them was older or in ill health. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of moving parts on the legal aspect, but you are right. You really want to do a good due diligence to see what is the book comprised of. No question, that's a key part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that very frequently, I think that goes overlooked, right? I think at least in the early stages, right? You look at the book of business, you're like, oh, wow, great. This revenue stream is going to look fantastic sliding into mine.
Exactly.
Let's go a little level deeper. Make sure that we have the right client mix there. One of the things that popped in my mind as I'm thinking about this is how to prepare, right? Because very few people wake up day after Thanksgiving, as we're recording this, and go, oh, you know what I want to do? I want to buy a business. Let's go do it right now, right? That's just, chances are they start thinking, well, maybe I need to grow through acquisition. Maybe I need to go buy another book of business. I'd like to grow. I'd like to that would give me the runway to continue to do some other things, whatever the goals may be.
Yep.
What are your suggestions for those advisors who are starting to think about it? And it may be in the next year or 2 years. And by the way, it could be both sides of that, right? If I'm somebody who's waking up and I'm thinking, you know what, I think I want out, or I think I want to have a different glide path, right, out of the industry. Like over the next decade, I want to kind of take my time and start to wind down. And then eventually, 10 years from now, 2030, I'm done, I'm retired. What are some of your recommendations for preparing for that?
So great question. I thought I'd use a great analogy for those of us that have all been homebound, right, with Netflix. If anyone has caught Cobra Kai.
Oh, yeah.
One, right, the Karate Kid. I just finished it last night, and I thought, what a great analogy. So those of you that haven't watched Cobra Kai, it is the successor to the Karate Kid, which in my generation was the American version of Bruce Lee, and Enter the Dragon. So a little bit of history there. But the cool thing about Cobra Kai, if you notice, there's two different competing dojos. There's LaRusso, the guy that owns the auto dealership, right? He was the famous one from Miyagi-Do. Miyagi was the more traditional martial arts, not about anger and vim and vigor, more about peace of mind and tranquility. And Cobra Kai, as we're learning, was the sort of no mercy, strike first, strike hard, no mercy. Well, think about this. The motivation for me to tell someone is, if you want to go into martial arts, which one would be better for you? If you want to go into acquisitions, you need to what? Get schooled on it, right? Go to your version of a dojo. So you read white papers, you listen to the Modern Financial Advisor podcast, you talk to your broker dealer, you join networks. Why? Because you've got to get up to speed, not just saying I've got some cash or I have an idea. What is it you want to buy? What's it going to add to? So number one, the analogy of joining the dojo, right? Join groups to try to find out more about what's going on in the M&A world. Certainly, the Zen of Business Acquisitions, pick up that book on Amazon that I have. That will help explain some of the foundations. And the third thing is, we talked about earlier, don't be afraid to ask questions of the brightest people you know. So I know all these advisors have very sharp business clients that they trust. Take one of your top clients, if you trust him or her, that has done well. Let's say they've owned Subway franchises, right? Or they've owned Dunkin' Donuts franchise. You can take them aside if you're comfortable and say, hey, I'm thinking about growing through acquisitions. You bought 5 Dunkin' Donuts. Tell me what it's like. You'll learn from that person. So, we call that sort of a deep dive on your top clients that you trust. So a lot of different ways to find out. But number one is get schooled. Number two is perseverance. You got to keep learning, get on podcasts, keep reading, and certainly get connected, because there are a lot of different stories out there of people who can point you in the right direction. And it's an exciting business. It really is.
I love the fact that you brought up, talk to people from outside of the industry who have been through some of these processes, right? Like seek outside guidance, wisdom, if you will, because our industry, I think maybe more than others, gets a little insular, right? Because look, the financial advisory business is fairly unique in several respects, right? I mean, if you're doing an asset management model, you bring on a client, as long as the client stays with you and has assets with you, you're going to get recurring revenue from that business, as long as they have it. And chances are, if you brought them on young, they're going to grow, and that revenue is just going to grow and grow and grow. And in some respect, you didn't have to do a whole lot of extra labor to increase revenue over the years, right? We're also incredibly asset light, capital light on the business, right? We didn't have to go buy a physical shop and worry about a lot of real estate and equipment and a lot of employees to do this, right? So you can run a very profitable, lucrative business with very few people and very minimal amount of other capital infrastructure. So in that respect, it's unique, right? But it is business. It's just business is business, right? And so learning from others in the world from outside of your industry is really, really important. I love that you suggested that. Well, as we get to closing out here, I know people are going to want to, first of all, get the book, The Zen of Business Acquisitions. It's on Amazon. Check it out there. And the audiobook is coming.
It did get #1 early release in its category when it came out. So for the few weeks it came out, I was proud of that. But it is on Amazon, and the audiobook should be out in January. So stay tuned. There is an ebook as well on there.
And I'll tell you what, I like it because it's a very approachable read, right? So it's written in a very conversational tone, which I always appreciate, right? So it's not like this dense, like, oh, this is brutal. I better a couple of more cups of coffee in me before I start reading. No, it's very, very conversational. The examples that you use, the parallels that you use, the Zen parallels, if you will, are very easy to digest, right? And not overly heavy-handed, right? Sometimes people beat analogies into the ground. It's really smooth and easy. But I assume other people are going to want to reach out to you. In addition to the book, they're going to say, hey, Tom, I need some help here. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways. We're on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, but Capital Wealth Management LLC in Glastonbury, Connecticut is where we're located. But you can look me up at also email me, Tom Hine at capitalwm.com. That's an easy one. But you'll find us out there in all the major areas. But the easiest one would be Amazon, because then you can find the book right away. But I would also pass on to the listeners that, if nothing else, this may motivate you someday to want to write your own book.
Yeah.
And that's a great way to market your own philosophy, your own firm. And it's just another hint to people out there that before you do acquisitions, you might consider writing your own flavor of a book on it, right? Then you get really up to school, because the research that I did for a year, I thought I knew a lot, Mike. Oh my gosh, I was like the brown belt, not the second degree black belt. I learned so much more by interviewing the Terry Mullins of the world. So even I got schooled, even though I thought I knew most of what I was doing.
I'm glad you brought that up to kind of close this out about, potentially writing a book. And I actually think, so you're the 4th or 5th author that we have had on this show. And some of them are financial advisors writing books specifically to the space. And others have been authors who wrote a book that was kind of more general business information that that was applicable here. I think I want to do something at some point in time to bring you guys together to talk about that process to me, because I've known a lot of folks who've written books. Many of them said, I'll never do it again. It was the most brutal process I've ever had to go through. And then I've got other friends who have they're on book like number 7, just crushing it. They're just banging books out like crazy. They've found their rhythm, whatever that rhythm is. I know that when I write, whether it's a blog post or even if it's a long strategic paper that I'm writing for a client or whatever, one of the things that's always interesting to me, yes, is a tool, right? It's a tool to market and whatever, but it's also a way of framing the ideas that are in your head. Like a lot of stuff just rattles around in there.
Right.
And then you got to get it out, organized, and communicate it so that it is digestible by other people. That's a very, very good process to go through.
Yeah, that would be maybe a subject for a new future podcast, is just get the authors together, sharing their different creative ideas, because I think your audience would like that too.
That'd be fantastic. Well, Tom, thank you very much for in your post-turkey coma morning, getting up and re-recording this podcast together. I really appreciate it. Like I said, I can't tell you how much this meant to me that you were willing to do so. Thank you very much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks again, Mike, and have a great rest of the year.
You too. Bye. All right. Thank you very much for joining Tom and myself for this episode of the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast. It means the world to me that you take time out of your day to listen to this show and now watch this show. So I'm incredibly grateful for that, especially day after Thanksgiving when we're recording this. You think about all the things that you're grateful for, and this community is really amazing, right? Just to see how many people listen and watch the show. We constantly get good feedback about the show. I like to think that it's actually making an impact, right? That it's helping you, that if there are some things about business acquisitions that you're thinking about, if you're considering selling your business or acquiring another business, that this was helpful, that you discovered the book. You heard a little bit from Tom, that the conversation we had, the two of us, gave you some new insights or some new ideas, or maybe some more confidence, right? Alleviated that anxiety, whatever it is. I'm grateful that you spend time with us, and I feel honored that we're able to hopefully bring something to you. Okay. Also, huge thanks to Tom. As you heard, this was the second time we recorded this episode of the podcast. We actually recorded the show a few weeks back, and that's usually kind of the timing. Like, you record the episodes, and it takes a couple of weeks before the releasing and so forth. And scheduling takes time. Getting on somebody's calendar, and then we write up the notes like, hey, here's some of the things we want to talk about, back and forth, and all that good stuff. Then you actually get down and you record the show. And then you go to post-production, you edit the show, and then you get it on all those podcasting platforms. As I mentioned, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, yada, yada. You get it up on YouTube. The video gets edited. Well, when we downloaded the files that for Tom and my original conversation, my audio was god-awful. It was just terrible. Some sort of weird static was in it. I'm like, well, okay, that's not a big deal. We'll go to the backup audio. I have a soundboard that we use here that records audio sound right from this professional level microphone via what's called an XLR cable right into the soundboard. There should be no interference, no nothing. It should just be pristine, crisp sound. And something went wrong there. I have no idea what was going on, but it was just this horrific staticky sound just on my audio. Tom sounded fantastic. But so, long-winded way of saying, it took some work, but we had to get Tom back on the show, and I really appreciate him carving out another hour of his time to do it, because that's very generous of him to do so. So huge thanks to you, Tom. Thank you very much. I hope this show was good for you. I know we're going to have Tom on the show for other topics. He and I were kicking some around. This is going to be great. All right. Hope you're having a wonderful day, enjoying the holidays with your family. Hope you're staying safe. Please do make sure you wear that mask, keep your distance, and be nice to each other, okay? It's a holiday time, all right? All right, we'll see you next time on the Modern Financial Advisor Podcast. All right, see ya. Bye.